Hey everyone, Tony D with a screenwriting tip by request. Let's talk about voiceovers or narration, as the case may be. Um, you got to be really careful with narration and voiceovers because it can be a crutch that annoys the moviegoer. When you're watching a movie and you're scripting a movie, it's show don't tell, and narration and voiceovers kind of fly in the face of that. So you have to be very wary about employing it. You know, it's different on, say, a TV show like The Twilight Zone, submitted for your approval. Rod Serling sort of established a pattern, and he had a great voice. It was his show, and that gave him a lot of gravitas to be able to do the voiceover for the Twilight Zone. You know, not everybody, like Jordan Peele now does the Twilight Zone, but, I always remember him from Key and Peele. So, if I see him trying to be serious, I just kind of like laugh because I think of him as a funny guy, as a comedian. So, to me, he's the wrong, sorry, I got some in my face, hair in my face. He's kind of the wrong host. Even if he's producing and directing it, I would have picked someone who's more serious, someone who's never played a comedic role, really. An actor with, like that guy from the insurance commercial, with the real baritone voice, the Allstate, that guy. Like, he would have been a great host. Someone like that. But this isn't about who hosts or who doesn't host. This is about whether or not you should use the voiceover at all. So, like in the Twilight Zone, well, it's an established pattern. So even if you're going to revise the show, you still need a narrator. But it's gone out of vogue in a lot of Hollywood things, and 9 times out of 10 when it's used these days, it's usually to fix a confusing movie. Like a movie got shot and there's a bunch of things that happened, and for whatever reason it's not really coming together as a narrative, and then they say, oh, well, let's do a voiceover here, and kind of, if you do a voiceover, understand you have to be committed to doing a voiceover not just once, right? You can't just do a voiceover one time. That's no good. You have to do a voiceover at certain times. Now, you could do one in the beginning and in the end. It's kind of a bookend, and you could get away with that, let's say. Maybe you do one in the beginning, and then occasionally the character, like, checks in, and you're really hearing his thoughts or her thoughts as the movie progresses. But it can get annoying real quick. You don't want to overdo it. Now, I've used it in screenplays, and I've had mixed reviews. I mean, I've had producers saying, no, I hate this, get rid of it. And I've had some saying, oh, that's kind of funny or whatever. Depends on the movie. If you're doing a comedy, for instance, voiceovers, pretty much anything goes in a comedy. So voiceovers, yeah, you could definitely use a voiceover to set things up. And every once in a while to tell a joke. Again, you can't overdo it, but you can't really overdo much in a comedy. You gotta always keep surprises happening. In a drama, man, that's tough. That's a lot tougher because part of what voiceovers do is they take you out of it, and you want people usually in a drama to be really deep in the movie, that they've forgotten about the outside world, and they're watching this story, and they just forget. It's like they're there. That's the kind of pull you want with a drama. So a voiceover kind of takes them out of it. So you have to be very aware of that. With a thing like a science fiction movie or a fantasy movie, a lot of times a voiceover might be used to explain something that's too complicated to just show. I watch Altered Carbon, which is on Netflix, and that's a pretty good show. So there's so many elements going on. The future is so complex in the Altered Carbon world. They use voiceovers to kind of set the stage, but they don't overdo it. It's usually just in the beginning to get things going, and if you're not on board from there, well, they just sort of shrug their shoulders and go, well, it's a sci-fi show. What do you want? They used it in Blade Runner, but that was more of a fix, right? The studio was mucking around with it. They were worried, and they kind of went back and forth on the whole voiceover anyway. I think for movies like action movies, probably not a great idea. If it's more comedic, maybe. For spy movies, I don't think I've seen a voiceover in James Bond unless it's sort of sometimes you can have overlapping dialogue, right? You can have a scene in which the character says, well, where do we go from here? And then it cuts to, a sweeping shot of pyramids, and you hear the dialogue from that previous scene saying, well, we have to go to Egypt. That kind of stuff. While technically a voiceover, it's kind of not. It's kind of more organic. It's kind of like sort of taking your cut and splitting it between the audio and the visual a little bit, and it can make for a smoother transition. Depending on the effect you want. You want that effect of an exotic locale like Egypt. You might want to do that. If you don't, then you might just do a straight up cut, or cancel the whole scene altogether and have somebody do a voiceover, or whatever. I mean, there's lots of ways you can do it. Is it a voiceover to hear someone's voice in a scene? Not really. I mean, it's sort of a voiceover if you have a scene, let's say someone's talking to someone on a smartphone and they're hearing their voice as they walk around the room, which we all do. And so they're paying attention to the voice and maybe they're even responding. It's not really a voiceover. That's more of like the character's not there, but they're in that world. I mean, mostly we're talking about narration, and narration just has to be very sparingly. You just want to use just enough so people are on board. You set the tone, or you explain the thing, whatever it is, and then you just go right into the story, because every second of that dialogue can pull people out of it. You can use narration to draw people in, but just understand that if you're in a critical moment in the story, narration is usually a bad idea. Once in a while, you could use it as a hook. Like if you had a character who every time he thought something, you went to the narration and it was very quick. It jumped back and forth between his dialogue and his thinking. That to me could work, but it would have to be very quick. It would have to be so quick that by the end of the movie, we were used to that. And so if we got to a critical scene, we'd, by that point, be sort of mentally trained and it wouldn't take us out of the movie. But if you have a scene, you're writing a screenplay and you're in the middle of the second act and suddenly things are getting complicated and you're like, well, maybe I could throw in a voiceover to explain it. That's going to be a tough call. It's going to be a tough call. Maybe out of a transition, right? So if you had a transition somewhere in the second act, let's say, and it was like 50 years later, I don't know, science fiction, let's say. You had this big wind up and now it's 50 years later, and for whatever reason, these characters are going to get back together in the second act. You might need a voiceover. I mean, there are stories like that. There's the Forever War. So, I mean, you could have a potential series like that. The Forever War, for those of you who don't know, was a sci-fi novel about a character who would travel at light speed back and forth from Earth, and he was basically jumping ahead to the future each time he did. Every time he came back to Earth, it was the future, and then he'd go and he'd fight the aliens, and by the time he'd come back, it was like the far future, and he had to deal with different technology and customs that had completely changed since he'd been gone. Other than that, can't really think of too many instances where you'd want a voiceover. It's really just the character's thoughts. and the omniscient narrator who's going to bring you in or bring you out. The character is usually better. A character narrating, I think, tends to be a stronger voice than an omniscient narrator. An omniscient narrator really takes you out of it. So you don't want to. You want to try to get a character that is at least in the story. Like, oh God, I can't think of the name. It's a famous movie where it starts with the death of the character. It's a black and white movie. Guy's in the pool and he's already dead, and then it goes back. Like that. That's a movie where you absolutely need narration, right? He's already dead, and he's narrating how he got killed, essentially. So you definitely need a narrator in certain cases, but you want him, if you just have a movie and you realize, well, I could cut all the narration and explain things in dialogue, you probably should. I would say 90% of the time. Unless it's a feature of the movie, unless it's super necessary, I would say stay away from voiceovers as a rule. But if you have a good twist on it, if you have a good idea, or it is important to the movie, or there's no other way to explain certain concepts that have to be explained, I think in a detective movie, sometimes it's almost a given that you're going to get some narration in certain detective movies. People kind of like it in that because it's sort of part of that genre, little subgenre of movies, the private detective movie. It was a dark and stormy day when she walked in, blah, blah, blah. I mean, sometimes that in and of itself will sell it to the audience, but you still can't slack off. You have to sell it, and you have to make that narration important. Understand that in those old movies, the narration then was important. It was important to the mystery. It was important to everything, and they still, back then, used it sparingly. Anyhow, that's my screenwriting tip for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Please, speaking of narration, check out my books at Amazon.com. We have Wokistan, a novel, a political satire, and of course, the Pioneers books 1, 2, 3, and 4, ebook, trade paperback, Kindle Unlimited is free, audiobooks coming soon, and of course, the Webcomic Factory, celebrating 10 years of webcomic goodness. We will see you next time.